Okay, so Sigmund Freud. Whoa. He's been so important in the 20th century to development and how we understand ourselves. There are words today that you use that have literally come from Freud. The idea that there is an unconscious and a conscious, where did that come from? Freud. The idea that one is egotistical, or one has an ego, Freud. He's a big deal. In his Civilization and its Discontents, in it he outlines 7 main ways human beings deploy mechanisms to cope with their suffering. So he says basically, okay, suffering is absolutely natural and is the constant in human experience. There's 3 main ways that people suffer. The first is through our body, so physical degeneration. We have a heart attack, lose a leg, that causes suffering. The second way is from the external world. You know, you're walking down the street and a car hits you. And the final way is your relations with other people, other human beings. And Freud says this causes the most suffering for humans, more than any other. So I want to just focus on this final one, human relations. Freud says there's 7 main ways people deploy coping mechanisms to overcome suffering in the realm of human relations. So when I was reading it was really helpful to me to understand which one I leaned more towards most of the time. There were certain ones which I could say, yeah, actually that's me. And it helped me sort of just realise and help me understand myself and how I work a little bit more, which is always a good thing. We really don't understand ourselves, and if we can just a little bit more, that's a good thing. So the first mechanism is deliberate isolation and keeping others at arm's length. Freud says this is the most obvious protection against suffering from other people. Just shut yourself away from people, or keep them, at a distance. Don't get too attached to people. Become a bit, you might become a bit colder, because if you do open up to people, you're more vulnerable. Freud says the happiness attained this way is the happiness of peace and quiet. And it's interesting, I think it is a stereotype that probably quite true, that old people, they do get a bit annoyed and grumpy when there's lots of noise, and they're quite known for wanting peace and quiet. And perhaps that's because that's their way of, coping with everything that goes on with them. Freud says, against the dreaded world, against the dreaded external world, one can defend oneself by somehow turning away from it if one wants to solve the problem unaided. Nice and simple. Just isolate yourself. Good job. Second way is through intoxication. Freud says this is the most crudest but most effective method of getting out of your suffering. It can cause direct feelings of pleasure, and when you are intoxicated, you're no longer susceptible to unpleasurable sensations. So if you're having a tough time, whatever, just have a drink, and soon enough you won't be sad anymore. But of course, Freud says it's not necessarily a good thing. Freud says not only individuals, but whole nations turn to this coping mechanism. We want independence from the external world, which is why we intoxicate ourselves. Drowning our sorrows means we can escape at any time the pressure of reality and find refuge in a world of our own that affords us better conditions for our sensibility. When we drink, we're free from the pressures of our minds. Freud says that's why intoxicants are so dangerous and harmful? Freud says, they are responsible for the futile loss of large amounts of energy that might have otherwise been used to improve the lot of mankind. Similarly, Nietzsche actually says the two biggest evils in Western Europe and Western society was Christianity and alcohol. Okay, the third main way, mania. Freud says this is a condition similar to intoxication, but without the external intoxicant. So you don't actually need to take any external substance for mania. Freud says it's a way in which your mind intoxicates itself. When your immediate environment, for example, is so miserable for so long, your brain adapts. You become crazy, for example, but you develop basically socially deviant ways of living, which Freud says is actually a coping mechanism in and of itself. And especially I see a lot of homeless people. You can tell, for example, that they're not all there, or there's one in my local high street who he's just constantly like nattering to himself, but he's not speaking, he's just sort of verbalizing things. And according to Freud, it's a form of mania which is helping him coping with his very miserable homeless life. Number 4, Freud says controlling yourself. This is also known as the wisdom of the East, or it's synonymous with the Buddhist tradition, which is that controlling your inner source of pain, of desire, of instinctual impulses. So, for example, if we have all these drives and satisfactions and desires in life, well, if we can't satisfy all of them, and because we have so many, that will inevitably lead to some suffering. So Freud says, why don't you just have less desires? Control yourself. If you have less needs and wants, you have less pain and suffering. So, Freud says, we can actually free ourselves of such suffering by depending less on our external sources for happiness, controlling the inner sources of our needs. So Freud actually goes on to talk about yoga and meditation and basically asceticism. And Freud says this is just a different route of getting to the destination of peace and quiet. So for example, if you want, if you need social status to be happy, if you need that new car to be happy, this way is saying stop needing the car, control your desires. It's interesting here because it's a real difference between the Eastern and Western philosophy. In the West, for example, we're always trying to uplift ourselves. We're always looking for something else to give us alleviation or a sense of meaning. Acquiring more, desiring more, doing this thing or that thing. It's an active, sort of positive way of living your life. But in the East, they go deeper and go within. They seek to influence their external environment through the controlling of themselves from self-restraint. They seek liberation, essentially. Okay, the 5th way, Freud says, is through mental and intellectual work. Freud says we achieve the most in our lives if we use this mechanism. Fate can then do little to harm us, as it will lead us always to work. The artist's joy in creating, in fashioning forth the products of his imagination. The scientist's in solving problems and discovering truths. This is how a lot of some people cope with suffering. Freud says, though, this is only accessible to the few. Not everyone, in the face of pain and suffering, if you just broke up with the love of your life, most people don't plunge themselves into their work, for example. Okay, 6, becoming a hermit. This person sees reality as the sole enemy, the source of all suffering, something one cannot live with, and one must therefore sever all links if one wants to be happy. The hermit turns his back to the world and refuses to have anything to do with it. Freud says one can go one further than just being a hermit, which is trying to recreate the world. Freud says to build another world in its place, one which the most intolerable features of this world are eliminated and replaced with those which accords with that hermit's desires. Freud, though, says anyone, as a rule, who takes this path in a spirit of desperate rebellion will achieve nothing. He says, but each of us, you and I, behaves like a paranoiac in some way, employing wishful thinking to connect some unendurable impact or aspect of the world and introducing this delusion to reality. He talks about religion. So he says, it is far too painful, for example, to know that if you're the love of your life, or a loved one, a parent, a sibling, if they die, it's less comforting. Actually, it's much more pain-inducing to think that they are in the ground, they're never coming back, and that's it, game over. And it's much more comforting to know, for example, that they're up in the sky in heaven, always looking down upon us. So he talks about this idea of wishful thinking in all of us, because we are essentially trying to recreate the world to suit ourselves. So in this sense, we're less concerned with the truth and more concerned with how we feel, how we can actually cope with suffering and make it less painful and durable. There's actually a TEDx talk which is pretty cool. I could put the link in the description, which essentially argues that modern humans today, do not have the capacity to see the world as it is. That we see the world as an illusion. He talks about how there was a time long ago when there were humans who could see the world for what it is. They could see the truth, but that wasn't necessarily conducive to surviving in their environment, and so they didn't survive for very long. And the humans that did survive were humans that told themselves stories, which were not necessarily true, but which helped them survive, which helped them cope with the pain and suffering of existence. There's a really cool book there's a really cool section in this book, Robert Bly, Men and Iron John, and he says this, and when I read this, actually, it really, I couldn't stop thinking about it for quite a while. He says, the knowledge of how to build a nest in a bare tree, how to fly to the wintering place, how to perform the mating dance, all of this information is stored in the bird's instinctual brain, in the reservoirs of the bird's instinctual brain. But human beings, sensing how much flexibility they might need in meeting new situations, decided to store this sort of knowledge outside the instinctual system. They stored it in stories. Stories, then, fairy stories, legends, myths, hearth stories, religion, amount to a reservoir where we keep new ways of responding that we can adopt when the conventional current ways wear out. The way we navigate our lives through stories, and without stories, then we don't really kind of get lost, and that's pretty interesting. The final way is love. The person who places love at the center of everything and expects all satisfaction to come from loving and being loved. We never have so little protection, and that's interesting, right? Because if love is a coping mechanism from suffering, Freud is saying now, we never have so little protection against suffering as when we are in love. Love is the primary source of so many people's suffering. We are never so desolate as when we have lost the object for our love. It's so true. And Freud is basically saying that's an interesting paradox here. On one hand, people find salvation from suffering in love. And on the other, it's this dangerous sort of conundrum between it being salvation and the source of our suffering, which really is the dance of life, you could argue. So the conclusion, according to Freud says, there's no real advice that would be beneficial to all people. Everyone must discover for himself how he can achieve salvation. Just as the prudent merchant avoids tying up all his capital in one place, so worldly wisdom will perhaps advise us to not expect all our satisfaction to come from one endeavour.